Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pflueger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes. Hey everyone, today it's just Andy Little and I, and we're going to actually be talking about research and kind of what all goes into it, how it gets off the ground. And the reason for that is I'm out on the landscape working quite often with producers, mainly with game birds, but they're always asking me, hey, why aren't you looking at this? Why aren't you researching this species or this predator or something like that? So I think Andy will be able to share some information just about research as a whole, which I think will be some good information to get out there. So to kick it off, Andy, why do we do research?
That's a great question. So yeah, it's obviously I got into this field. I love research and extension and translating this stuff back to the people. Ultimately, we do research because we want to be able to address questions of interest. And so, for example, say we want to know what's wild turkey survival. Well, we have to do a project to be able to take and assess what turkey survival is. And so essentially it's just really questions that are being generated that people are just curious, they want to know. And so then we develop research projects that can really address them. And so that's ultimately why we do research. Again, to find its discovery or finding information so that we can constantly improve on things. So for example, from a state agency, they can then use that data to then decide on maybe making certain changes in their, harvest regulations or, habitat management, schemes that they're working on the landscape, et cetera. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. So kind of like you said, there needs to be a goal and objective to the research, right?
Absolutely.
Because you could, have 1,000 different projects going, but you need to have a goal and objective of what you want to find out to help with management.
Yeah, and that's really important. And I always tell, especially my graduate students, what is the question you're trying to address? We got to lay that out to really clear. So it's really clear. This is what at the end of this project we're going to be able to address this question one way or another. And so if you don't have those questions or those objectives laid out, ahead of time, then it's basically you're just kind of like, aimlessly out there sailing in the ocean. You don't really have a target in mind. And so it's like anything else in life. And I think about, developing habitat management schemes for a property. You go into it, you say, all right, here's what I want to do. I want to see an increase in quail numbers or an increase in deer numbers or an increase in whatever, or maybe I need to see a decrease in, say, red cedars. Ultimately, you have an objective, a very clear, objective and goal that you're laying out that you want to be able to address. And then you come back at the end of that and say, did we accomplish what we set out to do? So yeah, just setting that out at the beginning is really important for any project.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you have your research question. Let's back up a little bit. What's the difference between researching wildlife as opposed to maybe row crops or something that's easily replicable, unlike wildlife?
Yeah. No, that's a great one. And really, I think that kind of necessitates the point of this episode is we get these questions a lot about, just general, why are you doing research? How do research projects work? And so something like that, where you're doing an experiment, say in an ag-dominated landscape, where you could look at different, if I apply this level of, say, nitrogen to this field versus this other level, and then I can see what is the crop response in that application. You can do them within a field versus, oh, hey, I have an animal that I put a GPS transmitter on and they walk 100 miles like some of our pronghorn did. You sit there and say, well, how can I, we're really thinking about this from an observational standpoint. And so that's one of the differences, just to kind of let people know. So with research, what we do, you have basically kind of observational based projects. So that's like, for example, we're putting a collar out in an animal, we're tracking them, we're looking at survival, we're looking at what types of vegetative cover that they're selecting for, versus like a manipulative experiment. So that's where we have like control and treatments, and that's like some of the ag focused type things. And we can probably in a minute dive into some differences between a couple of projects that I actually have or been involved in that, are both essentially. One's manipulative and then one's actually is that more observational based project. So.
Yeah, which I think is important to note. Because when you're working in a natural ecosystem,
Sure.
there's going to be stuff changing all the time
Absolutely.
that you then have to factor into, well, this happened and made this species do this or something.
Well, and I think that's the big challenge. We work in outdoors. We can't control the weather. We can't control all kinds of different factors. And so, I always say, we're not in a chemistry lab where we can take and we can control a lot of different external factors. There are things that are just totally out of our control. So one year you could have a massive drought, which obviously could still play in from an agricultural standpoint. You're doing an ag experiment that could affect your results. Maybe you don't have the plant growth that you expected to have because you had a drought one year. And that's why, and we'll dive into this a little bit later on, is the amount of time some of these projects can take is, it can be a few years for these projects to come to completion. Unfortunately, we live in a society, and I like to point out my phone, is it's very much instantaneous. We want to be able to have that answer immediate. And so the stuff that we do, though, is just, it just takes so much time to be able to get to do that. And so, again, from like the observational side, that's what I would say is probably largely most wildlife-based projects are observational. There are obviously cases of manipulative-based experiments out there. But most of them are going to be that observational, where we're just taking in, monitoring things through time, and then we can take them. And in some ways, it's really kind of a, correlative to some level, because ultimately, you're saying, okay, well, I know that animal selected that, cover in the landscape, but was that really the best cover, or was that really all they had in that landscape? And therefore, that's where they just happen to occur. So, you want to think about that as you're trying to manage the landscape as well. So
definitely. So you're sitting down with a grad student, you have your question. Sure. What's the next step? How do you pull together funding, partners? I mean, that has to seem like a pretty daunting task.
Yeah. So, and I guess kind of to back up a little bit, usually how these projects come to fruition is, and I'll kind of give you a couple different examples. One is you have, like, say, for example, a state agency like Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. It says, we have these questions that we would like to address.
Okay.
How do we address these questions? What ways can we, for example, monitor turkeys, or, go out and monitor pheasants and help improve our management efforts on the landscape? And so they would come to a researcher or researchers and say, hey, here's some things questions we'd like to explore. How do we do that? And so then the researchers would then, work with the agency to design a proposal, which then they would kind of go back and forth on what, the questions that they have, and here's kind of how we would go about doing that. And then have that discussion about, okay, how do we, make this all work? Versus some other, projects, and I know we get into this, especially in the, the federal level. You have, National Science Foundation funding or USDA funding, where you may have more of a competitive process. And so therefore you're basically taking, and they have some general guidelines, and then you're writing a proposal specific to that. You're designing the project and you're sending it in, and then they have reviewers that are going to review all those applications that they get in, all those proposals, and they're going to say, okay, we have X amount of money to give away, basically to, grant out to these funding or to these projects. Ultimately, they have to decide, we can't fund them all. So we have to decide which ones have the best merit and which ones do we want to invest in. And a lot of times it really comes down to, and how they make those decisions, if you have some preliminary data going into it on whatever topic area, that makes a stronger proposal. So they see that you've already been able to collect some preliminary information.
Okay.
Ultimately, those agencies want to know that you're going to be able to do what you set out to do, that we're not just going to give you money and you're not really sure how to accomplish that.
And you do that with like pilot projects, essentially, where you're just
Yeah.
really small scale
Yeah.
research
Yeah, and
projects.
hopefully some of the stuff with even some of the cover crops work that you're involved in, that could hopefully turn into some things that's some pilot project type data you're collecting at those sites, and then you can use that in a proposal to get funding to launch into some bigger projects then.
So absolutely. So funding is a word that's always talked about when
Yeah,
it comes to research, and it's scarce most of the
yeah,
time. How expensive are research projects? And I know there's
yeah.
variability
Oh,
depending on
sure,
what you're doing, but
sure. Yeah, it all like you said, it all depends on the projects that you're involved in. Largely, especially when you get into some of these like telemetry, GPS based projects where we're having to buy transmitters. Those transmitters could cost upwards of $1,500+
wow.
per transmitter. And so you start multiplying that out, and you're saying, okay, well, I want to get 100 of those transmitters. You're already in the six figures right there just with transmitters. You haven't included anything else,
Yeah.
vehicles, technicians, graduate students, anything else. So you're automatically, that technology costs a lot of money. And again, it all depends on what your objectives are. And that's why I always go back and say, what are your questions and how do we do this most efficiently, so that we can accomplish and address those questions that you have. So, we're spending that money in a very wise way. So.
Yeah. And for somebody that's like, well, why do you need 100 GPS backpacks or whatever? You
Sure.
need repetition, right?
You
For
do.
quality
Yeah.
research.
Yeah. Yeah. So ultimately, you want to be able to, like you were talking about with ag landscape, replicating these, if you have different treatments to kind of, look at the differences between one field versus another field. Because ultimately, what if it was just one unique thing about that field and that's what gave you those results? Well, now you basically have created kind of a skewed response in a sense. So you're saying, well, yeah, I just have one field, I have one replicate, that's it. I had no other replicates of that treatment that I was doing. And that's why you end up, if you want to try to take and go across multiple different landowner properties that have different management objectives, it creates, additional variation in there that we have to be able to control for. But ultimately, as you kind of go through those project design, you think about those questions as that's kind of your foundation, I guess, to kind of set that stage, and then we kind of start building out from there for the experimental design onward. So,
Okay. You kind of mentioned graduate students. I
yeah.
mean, they're pretty important when it comes
Oh,
to
yeah.
research projects, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So back to even some of the costs too to that. So, graduate students, they come in, they're doing the work for us. So we write grants. So these proposals we put together, and maybe I'll kind of step through that a little bit. So, we put together a proposal, and I'll kind of use maybe some examples from some projects I've been involved in. One more recently was our wild turkey project. Here in Nebraska. And so Nebraska Game and Parks Commission came and said, hey, we have these questions, about nest survival, brood survival, where are these birds moving? What are they selecting for in the landscape? What does genetic diversity look like? How is the timing of the hunting season relative to gobbling chronology? All those things were questions that they came to us and said, how do we address these? And so we developed a proposal. We worked with them on that and then basically said, okay, here's kind of how we're going to set out to do this. Well, ultimately, as you mentioned with graduate students are doing that work. They're the ones that are going to go out and accomplish those objectives that we've laid out. And so we have to pay them. Typically, a graduate student is going to be somewhere between $20,000 to $30,000 annually. They basically also get some healthcare coverage with that, and then in addition to that salary, and then they usually will get like their tuition is waived as a component of that, or basically as a component of the total amount. So essentially, what happens is you're having to pay for that student annually, and say you have a PhD student, you're talking, it could be, total with all the additional costs there, it could be $40,000-$50,000 annually.
Wow.
And so you start adding that up, you're easily, again, six figures within within a few years, plus all your other, equipment costs. And you got technicians that you have to go out there and collect this data. And so they obviously are usually hourly workers that are going to work for you. So you're building that in, and then travel and other types of cost to that. But back to the graduate students, they're the ones that are out there. Them and the technicians are doing this work to be able to accomplish these objectives. So they're out there, and they're getting paid to do this. Or they're also going to classes. That's a part of their degree requirement. And so they do all of that, and they're basically getting paid to go out and do research essentially.
Well, and for somebody that's like, well, why are you paying the students? I mean, that's basically their full-time job.
That is, yeah. So they can't have another full-time job. This is in this like type of like GRA, graduate research assistant type position, that is their job essentially. Now there are obviously other programs where you may have like a master's of applied science, for example, or maybe you're taking this kind of in your spare time, but you're not doing maybe a real traditional research project where you're out there day in and day out collecting data. Like for our turkey project, our students start in January and they're out there until early August, collecting data on these turkeys. So again, several months of the year, they're out there. And then they come back for classes for the fall, but they do have to periodically go out and take and check on the birds, download data, maybe finish up a few little odds and ends that weren't done earlier. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when it comes to having partners, so obviously sometimes you said somebody brings research questions to you. When you're developing your own project with your own questions, is it better to bring outside partners in? Does that help with a research project? Or?
Yeah, I think it definitely helps to have different partners on projects. But I think ultimately, like any of the projects I've really been involved in, you have really a combination of partners, some that are not providing any funding, some are really, you have your landowners you're working with. You got landowners that are saying, "Hey, I'm happy for you to come do this project on my property." So that's a partner, maybe not in kind of that financial sense where they're providing you funds to come there, but they're providing you land, so access. And then you obviously have other funders. You could have foundations. You could have for example, like in Nebraska, we have the Nebraska State National Wild Turkey Federation, their group. They help support, and they've actually been providing funds to our turkey project here, in addition to what Game and Parks is also providing. We have National Wild Turkey Federation at that level. They're also providing funds for components of our project. So really sky's the limit in a sense, where you can find other opportunities out there, maybe in some of the non-traditional state, federal type partners that are out there from a funding standpoint. But really, all those different partners are all providing different, support capacity, if you want to say, from landowners onto, say your state agency that's funding a good portion of the project.
Yeah, and you brought up landowners. I mean, that's a really important partner.
Absolutely.
When it comes to wildlife research.
Yeah, we couldn't do it without landowners. That's just the reality of it. And so we're very, very grateful for all the work that we do with landowners. Again, a state like Nebraska, 98% privately owned. Ultimately, it comes down to working with them. I think I mentioned one of the other podcast episodes. For our pronghorn project, we had over 300 plus landowners that we worked with to get access to be able to go out and capture pronghorn and during the study. And so, without that access, we wouldn't have been able to do that project. So we're very grateful for all the landowners out there that are doing amazing things and allowing us to get access to their property for these projects. And then also, again, and this is the point of kind of this translation, and we can probably get into this in a minute, but taking that science and taking it back to them and co-creating a better tomorrow for people. And so how do we do that in ag landscapes? And that's where our lab, the Awesome Lab, and we really focus on that. We say, how can we take in a very ag-dominated landscape, find that balance for conservation, while also recognizing that producers, landowners are out there, they're trying to make a living. You got a $500,000 piece of equipment sitting out there, every acre counts. That's just the reality of the world we work in. And so we have to be able to find ways, not necessarily cookie cutter ways, because I'd argue that doesn't really occur very often, but find ways that we can help them be able to maximize production for what they are trying to do, feeding and fueling the world, but also ensuring the sustainability of that natural world for future generations. So,
yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things that can be frustrating from an outside of research standpoint is just the time that it takes. It's like, okay, you've started this project, and I'm sure once somebody hears that a project has been started, they're already asking you for, well, what'd you find out? Yeah. And that's not the case, is it?
No. And again, that goes back to this instantaneous, having a phone, it's kind of, we live in this society where everything is, I actually also joke, it's kind of like the microwave generation. You want things instantaneous. And honestly, I'm probably one of the most impatient people. I want this stuff to happen now. But it just, it just doesn't. And ultimately these projects, they take a few years. And then we, collect all this data. Then at the end of it, a student will then either develop a thesis or a dissertation, depending on if they're a master's student, they develop a thesis, a dissertation if they're a PhD student. Basically, what that all means is they're taking all those results and they're writing that up and looking at other papers, other projects out there that either support or refute things that they had found, and then basically sharing that through a peer-reviewed process that we take and then send those papers out for review. And then we have other scientists across the world that vet that science to say, hey, is this worthy of being in a peer-reviewed journal? In doing so, then we're getting that science out to that scientific community. But then the flip side, and where I do a lot with my extension position, is taking that science and translating that back to those landowners. So we're working with them to get access to start doing these projects, like our turkey project, capturing turkeys, monitoring them in the landscape. They want to know, well, where are these birds going? Well, again, it takes a few years to get all this data compiled. But one of the things we're doing each year, and I've heard so many positive comments from landowners and our staff in the field, giving 1-year updates on where we're at, the project. And again, you always have to have the caveat that's 1-year data. So we don't know if it's going to change over the course of the entire project, but it's 1-year data, but we want to continue to keep people informed along the way. And I would argue also one of the other great things that we do, and we have Iris McFarland, and our social media and kind of communications person, she handles all our social media outlets, is taking that information and getting that out to the public. And so simple things like, hey, we found this turkey moved 23 miles. That was pretty amazing. I didn't realize they moved that far. So just simple things like that we can start translating and showing people, and really, honestly, demystifying that scientific process. Because I think that's really important that we do that. Because I think that sometimes it's kind of the assumption that, oh, this is kind of this black box type thing, and nobody really knows what you're actually doing until the project's over with. And so giving those annual updates to landowners also helps generate even new ideas, because they're the ones that are living on that land. They see this stuff day in and day out. And then getting their feedback to also feed in and say, hey, this individual has been seeing these responses on their property, or hey, they're really interested in doing X, Y, and Z for their property to benefit this species. How can some of the work already start helping them make some decisions now? So
yeah, definitely. You mentioned upon completion of research, sharing that information with the scientific community. When you share it and others see that research, and then they do another research study to see if they found the same thing, right? That's how you build merit, right?
True. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so ultimately, we're out there to kind of seek the truth, and ultimately, as you realize, and we talked about earlier, these projects, we're like moving in that direction. We recognize that if we take into a project in one area, those results may not necessarily translate to another area, because there's a lot of different factors that play into that. And that's ideally, we all want the easy button per se, of like, if we just do this is going to fix all that stuff. Well, you could go 5 miles down the road and those results that you have from something could be different for a different area, because they have different landscape features. There could be, even if you want, like, say you went from one side of the state in Nebraska to the other, you have different climatic patterns, so different weather patterns out there that may affect some of those results. And so that's why the more and more studies that get generated around some of these topics, the more you start to see some common things. So for example, we'll use pheasants as an example of this, a lot of work on nesting and brood rearing cover. So and this has kind of been across the range. And so you start to see some common patterns that start, come popping out. Plant communities may be different from, say, California to Pennsylvania, but you start to say, okay, well, here, generally, structurally, these are some things that we can be thinking at a broader scale to be managing for. And again, the more that work provides that data, the better. And that helps those landowners, especially locally, decide on, well, okay, if I want more pheasants, or I want more quail, or I want more of this or that, what do I do to get to that, ultimately? So
definitely. And I think you kind of brought up or covered it really well, because right now, I think you mentioned that currently there's the most turkey projects that have ever been ongoing in multiple states. So if somebody from the outside's like, why are we researching turkeys when they're doing that down south or whatever? But it builds to that point,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah. Well, you look at some of these birds, like for example, we're over in the eastern part of the United States. They have obvious eastern subspecies of wild turkeys. They don't move typically as far as some of these birds we're going to see in the western part of Nebraska and in some other Midwest states where you have in western states you get into the Merriams, which again another subspecies. Because again, landscape's very different. You go from say Georgia where you have a very pine dominated landscape in portions of the state to out here where you don't have a lot of trees in a lot of places. And so you have very ag dominated, a lot of row crop, a lot of rangeland production. So again, the results there may not necessarily translate to here. And so that's the point of having replication of these studies in different states, different regions, providing that information so that again, our job as researchers is simply to provide the data to policy and decision makers, and they take that information and they make decisions based off of that. We don't sit here and make decisions for them. That's their job and that's what they do. And ours is to collect that data. So ultimately, we provide all that data to those agencies, and they say, okay, well, here's what we may want to do based on that information.
Absolutely. So have you ever got to the end of a research project and you're like, well, we answered all the questions? Does that happen?
No, every project generates I feel like another 1,000 more questions out of it because you start wondering like, well, why did that occur? Or what happened here? And some examples, I'll use one of them from our pronghorn study here in Nebraska. Luke Meduna, who's a big game coordinator for Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, him and I were sitting down in my lab the one day, and we were just kind of going through some of the data from different individuals. And we were looking at some of these individuals where, they started making some transitions where they were spending time in some winter wheat fields, and they were moving out through the sand hills to presumably their summer range. And then partway through that transition, they made a trek back to those same agricultural fields. Well, the question is that possible it was just a weather issue? Like maybe it started, getting some snow and they, got really deep and they decided, hey, I'm heading back this way where I have a known food source. So there's all these questions that are just starting to populate in our minds. And we're like, well, what happened with that one? What happened with, and so you start thinking about all this stuff and ultimately just generate so many different questions that then that can turn into future projects.
That then you're restarting the process, right?
You're right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that discovery through addressing those questions that we have through the research, then we take that and we can translate that back. And I think that's to me is one of the most important things that is, especially from a landowner's perspective, we're seeing the money being put into these projects. And again, I recognize that it's like, building a house. It's complicated. You have to go down and pick out, you're starting brand new. Okay, I need to pick out this paint or I need to pick out these doorknobs. All that takes time and it also costs money to do all that. And so all these projects, they do take some time and they do cost money to accomplish these things. But at the end, you can provide some really interesting information, which again, in our case, I see a lot of new projects then being generated because you see, oh, hey, well, we didn't really look at that. And again, one project, you can't answer all the questions out there. I commonly get that question. Well, why didn't you look at this? Well, it would be great if we could, but unfortunately, there's only so much time and resources available. Even just on our turkey project right now, we currently have 3 graduate students in the project. We'll be adding a 4th one here in the near future. But again, it's one where you're sitting there and, okay, well, we could do, 5 other things if you wanted to, but that's going to require more students, more resources to get that done. So
Absolutely. So it's just like research is kind of like an evolution, right? I
sure.
mean, it's just baby steps, but
Yeah.
you figure out this question, then it then opens the door to another question and
Yeah.
so on and so
Yeah.
forth.
And there's a lot of, I think the thing that excites me is just the discovery, like growing up as a kid in Pennsylvania and just, I love being outdoors and just, the natural curiosity of the world is really what I think drove me towards the position that I'm in now. Because I just enjoy learning about nature and whether you're out hunting or you're hiking or spending time just outdoors in general, you start asking questions. Well, I wonder why that is occurring. And so that, again, is kind of how some of these projects do get started is just some natural curiosity about questions that are of interest. Obviously, things that maybe, from a state perspective could be important for state management, whether it be like the wildlife management areas or regulations or things like that. That's how other projects get started. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different avenues to it. So
when you're putting research out there on the landscape, obviously you want it to be good solid research.
Oh yeah.
What's the difference between good research and maybe a bad research project, or
Yeah,
how does
that's
that?
a great question. I One of the big things is replication. I think is really important. One is I maybe even start before replication is really that going back, and I'm harping on the questions, because if you don't have a very good, well defined question, research question, you're again, it's like you're kind of shooting out in the dark. You have no target that you're really targeting, and so being very explicit in that. And one of the things I really enjoy, especially when we're in the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission and some of their proposals that we've put together in the past, we always put a section in for expected results and outcomes, because ultimately that's what they want to know. Like, okay, out of this research, what are we likely to see from this? How can this help us? And so then we, build those proposals around that to ensure that what we get out at the end of the day is going to be helpful. It's going to be good science. And so, going back to the replication, I think, you can't, if you say you had 100 transmitters and say you wanted to look at, some different habitat types that they were selecting for, and you were trying to design some manipulative based experiment. Well, you wouldn't want to divide your transmitters up that you only had a sample size of like 3 turkeys in one area, or 3 transmitters in one area and 3 in another. And then, because you're not going to be able to say much, because what happens if, 2 of those individuals die? Now you're down to 1.
Absolutely.
Well, you have 1 individual out of a population. You can't really make much inference off of that. And so ultimately, that's why you want to have, again, we do things like power analyses, which I'm not to get into a lot of statistics on that, but it's basically to help decide on sample sizes, like how many individuals are going to be necessary, so we can actually decide, how many transmitters we need to purchase, or how many field plots we need to potentially utilize to be able to try to accomplish some of the questions that we have set out. So.
Absolutely. And I think that's really insightful, just research as a whole, because I
Sure.
think you've mentioned it. It's just kind of mysterious, right?
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of folks just
Yeah.
aren't interested in it. And then when they see the paper on the back end,
Yeah.
it's a lot of confusing graphs and pictures and
Yeah.
wording. So,
Well, and I think that's one thing, in our profession that I'm seeing a growing trend in, and I personally, I love it, being an extension, is translating that science back out to the people that are actually going to implement those things. So, for example, if you want to take and create habitat conditions to better benefit pheasants or quail in the landscape, well, doing that research, and then we publish these papers. Well, those papers, in a peer-reviewed journal, a lot of people probably aren't going to read them that are in the non-scientific community, not like non-researchers. And so, and even if you do read them, some of them can be hard to read and comprehend. They can put you to sleep. So,
definitely.
so there's a whole art to that as well in writing those type of papers. But ultimately, those type of things then, from my perspective as an extension specialist, I take that work and I can translate that information out to the general public and show what these different studies are showing, and how can you as a landowner do different things if you're wanting to, again, improve habitat for quail and pheasants in the landscape. What does that research show? And how does that help you as a landowner, land manager, to improve conditions so you can actually benefit that species? So.
And I think that's a good way to wrap it up. It's really just saying, hey, we want to do this research, but
Sure.
then we want it to have an effect out
Yeah.
on the landscape.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's, really important. We can, and I always tell this, especially the students as they're wrapping up their degree programs, your work is not done from your thesis or dissertation until those papers are published. Because ultimately, that is kind of the, getting that information out. And then again, that's part of my job, is to take that information, translate that down to what are the simple messages that people, need to know from this work. And so one way we've been actually doing that, we have a variety of ways, but I talked about social media being one. But something we started a couple of years ago is we basically are doing at the conclusion of projects, having our students, Iris McFarland, who's our communication specialist I mentioned earlier, is basically videoing those students and having them talk a little bit about their research and talk about, maybe 2 to 3 important takeaways that can be applicable to that land manager out there, because that is extension. You're taking and helping co-create that better tomorrow, helping those individuals see what potential that they have based on that work, that research, to actually do things on their lands to benefit whatever you're focused on, say turkeys, pheasants, deer, whatever. So, yeah.
Which is great. And I think those extension educators have a huge job in being that buffer between
Absolutely.
the scientific community and
Absolutely.
they do great work,
They
and
do.
they're definitely underappreciated.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, the extension folks are great, and we're hoping to continue to build capacity in that realm. Here in Nebraska, finding ways that we can continue to get that information out to people, because ultimately, if we want to have a landscape scale impact, and that's what we talk a lot about in our lab, is having a landscape scale impact. You're going to have to work with your neighbors. You're going to have to take and implement habitat management efforts that are going to actually benefit those species you're interested in, across boundaries, cross property boundaries. And in some cases, maybe not all landowners, have the same objectives. And so finding, again, ways you can develop maybe conservation cooperatives and taking some of that research to actually implement at maybe a larger spatial scale. Because that's one of the things that we see a lot, and we talked a lot about this earlier, in wildlife studies. You have species that are very mobile. Maybe a plant community is not necessarily a mobile, type thing, but a species that is mobile, they move 20 miles away or more. Well, you want to be able to think about that from a landscape, a larger perspective, and how can we best manage and create connectivity amongst patches. And then in a state like Nebraska, and this is why our lab is really laser focused on this, how do you implement conservation strategically in this landscape, knowing that that is probably not the number one, funding source per se for that landowner. It's usually, it could be a component of it, maybe from a hunting perspective, maybe they have a hunting lease or whatever, but it's usually production ag. And so that's their main livelihood. And so, thinking about, okay, how do we implement things that are going to actually benefit them, but also ensure that they can be able to meet those production needs that they have. So
absolutely, which is, like you said, really important in Nebraska, where it's heavily privately owned.
Absolutely.
State.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think we did a good job covering just general research.
Sure.
We could go on and on about that.
Yeah. People have questions, they can just shoot an email to us, wildagpodcast@gmail.com, and they can, send in questions about this. And, we're always eager to share that. And then one of the things I really am personally, really focused on is how can we, again, demystify this scientific process. Even simply things, and we've talked about this in the past, is, how do you go out and capture some of these animals, to go put GPS tags on them? Like just simple things like that maybe I take for granted, but just sharing that out there so people can kind of walk along almost like a journey with these projects, so they get to see, what's going on and what all goes into these things. So yeah, with that, people can reach out to us with more questions. So.
Yeah, please, like Andy said, submit those questions, because we want to hear from you. We want to put topics and things in front of you that you want to listen to and learn more about. So yeah, please reach out, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks again.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.